I will go over Intermediate Java Lesson 2. Today we'll be going over nested loops. So what is a nested loop? A nested loop is where you have another loop inside of a loop. So for example, over here you have a for loop inside of a while loop. So what happens with these nested loops is every time the while loop has run once, the inner loop within it has run completely. So for example, if this one has 25 iterations and this one, let's say, has like 50 iterations, for the while loop, when it has run one time, this for loop has already run 25 times. And then each additional time that the while loop runs, this one runs an additional 25 times. So let's take a look at an example of this. So over here, we've created some counters, and now we have our outer loop, which is dependent on the x variable. And the x variable will iterate from 0 all the way to 9 until the end of this while loop. Then we also have our inner while loop that will iterate from 0 to 10. So real quick, pause the video and think about what you think the print statement will output and what this will look like. Yeah, so if you look at the output, it's actually going to be from 0 to 100. So if we look back at the code, we can kind of piece through this. As we see over here, it's multiplying x by 10, and it's multiplying y, it's just adding y to it, where y can reach up to 10. So if you break it down and you try to think about it, when x is 0, this is just going to be 0, but then after that, it's going to be adding 10, it's going to be adding 20, 30, 40, so on, up until it adds 90, because the max value for x will be 9. So at max, it's adding 90, and then the max number being added for y is going to be 10. So your max is 100, and your minimum will be 0 when each of these are 0. And you'll see how each time y is going to be increased as you're going through this loop, those 10 times. And then over here at the end of each one, once you're out of this while loop, you'll see how x is incremented and y is reset for the next time. Now we'll go over nested for loops. So we just saw nested while loops, so let's take a look at these for loops. So this code right here also counts from 0 to 100, but in a slightly different way. So over here, you can see we have our start, our stop, and our step, and these are all built into the for loop, so there's no need to create them separately. So here you can see this one starts from 0, it ends at 9, it's going to increment by 1 each time. And then j also starts at 0, it ends at 10, and it increases. And here you can see we have the same logic of I times 10 plus j. Now let's go ahead and try this out. So I want you to use nested loops to draw a 4x5 asterisk rectangle. Something to keep in mind is the difference between system.out.print and system.out.print line, since this will be pretty useful to you. To show you the difference between them, I'll go ahead and run this code real quick to kind of break down the difference. So as you can see here, my first asterisk is using system.out.print line. What this means is that after I printed it, it's going to automatically have a new line after it. However, if I have system.out.print, it's not going to have a new line after it, so that next thing I print out, whether it's system.out.print or system.out.print line, is going to be on the same line. So you want to keep this in mind as you're trying to create your rows versus your columns. Pause the video, work through this, and unpause when you're ready to see the solution. Okay, now let's go over the solution. So over here, we're using nested for loops, and as you can see, on the outside, this is for the amount of rows that we're going to have, the 4 rows. We're going to go from 0 all the way until 3. So 0, 1, 2, 3 is going to make 4 rows. And then in here, we'll have the 4 columns. So within the columns, you can see that we're using system.out.print because we want all the asterisks in a row. But then whenever we move from one row to the next, we go ahead and we print a new line so we can jump onto a new row. Now, I want you to alter your code to draw a 3x10 asterisk rectangle. As you're working on this, if you find yourself changing a lot of code, you might want to pause and really just look at your code and try to understand it, since there really should only be 2 changes that you're making. Now that you've hopefully had a chance to pause and make the change to your code, I'll go over the solution. So here you can see that just instead of doing 4 and 5, we just did 3 and 10 instead in order to get our 3 rows, our 3 rows and our 10 columns. Now I want you to go ahead and take an integer input, and I want you to use nested loops to make a multiplication table of that size. A hint is that you want to use Scanner. So think back to what we've learned about Scanner. Make sure you're importing it, make sure you're setting it up correctly, and go ahead and try to do this yourself. This is an example of the output. Now that you've hopefully had a chance to try it out, let's go over the solution. So this is an example solution where, as you can see, we're importing Scanner, then we're going to go ahead and create a new instance of it, and we'll print out instructions, and we're getting the next integer that they put in. It's important that you do this instead of like next line, so that we actually get a number and we aren't getting a string. After that, make sure you store that in a variable, and then within each of these 2 loops, you're going to go ahead and set the boundaries as the size, and you'll be multiplying the 2 numbers in order to get the value. And then you can also add this. What this will do is it'll add just like a tab to space it out, as you can see here. And then finally, you can add a new line between the rows. Now we'll be going over some review. So as I'm going through this, feel free to pause as needed and think about the response before you see the answer. First, where would using nested loops be more efficient than not using them? So an example of this would be maybe not necessarily things like small tasks like counting from 1 to 10, but things where you're doing something repetitively, such as drawing a rectangle of asterisks, where you're repeating that same row or the same column. Next, if an outer loop iterates 3 times and an inner loop iterates 6 times, how many times will the entire nested loop iterate? So the entire loop will iterate 18 times, so 3 times 6. Last, what could happen if you use the same counter for 2 loops in a nested loop? What could happen is that the program would be changing the same, would be that both would change the same counter simultaneously, and it could just be a bit messy. So you just want to make sure that you're not using the same counter. And that's it for this lesson. Thank you for listening.